Debra Jay, welcome.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here with you.
We're glad you're here. We're glad you're back in Tennessee.
It's nice to be back in Tennessee.
Yeah.
It's just such a beautiful state.
I think you brought some warm weather with you, although you were probably coming from the cold. I'm not sure.
Coming from the cold, so if I did bring the warm weather, the people in Michigan are not happy with me.
That's right.
They're waiting for it.
That's right. When was the last time you were here at Cumberland Heights? Do you know?
I think
Do you
10
remember?
years ago.
No kidding.
I mean, it flies, you know. It's been
Yeah.
a long time. But, you know, when I drove up, I thought, wow, I remember what a beautiful campus this is.
Did you?
I mean, it
That's
really
kind.
just struck me because it's just stunning immediately, you know. It's just like such a great place. It's beautiful.
Yeah, thank
Love
you.
it.
Yeah. And I'm sure that the facility probably looks a lot similar, right? We got some changes that I'm sure you heard about that are going to be happening over the next few years, which we're excited about. But it's a good, it's accessible to the city. And we're a little bit out, but we're still connected. And I think it's good for us to kind of connect on this drive, the River Road Drive, as we all talk about it. So it's a good like reflection point for all of us as we're driving out here.
Well, and I think for people who come here, I think it's so important, you know, if you study emotional design, that a lot of clinical problems can just go away because people can get outside and it's beautiful.
Right.
And the air is fresh and the trees, and that does so much for anybody. But somebody, you know, coming into treatment, that's an enormous thing. I think it takes care of a lot of things.
Yeah.
Just that.
Maybe like a reprieve or a reset.
Like
away
a
from.
reset, and I think just a kind of a spiritual experience, you know, of the world. And, you know, when the drugs are out of your brain for a while, and then all of a sudden things start becoming technicolor again, you know, and you can start seeing the world clearly, and then you're in a place like this. It's
special.
Yeah, it's important.
Just given your experience, I was just thinking about how the world has changed so much with these little smart devices that we all carry around and how inundated we are with information. And I was thinking about the experience of a patient. You're probably right on showing up and being totally disconnected in a lot of ways, at least in the beginning, digitally, and how much of a net positive that can be. By way of working with families over the last 10 years since you were last here and beyond, because I know you worked at Hazelden and Betty Ford for a number of years.
I was at Hanley Hazelden.
No
so
kidding.
It's before Betty Ford and Hazelden that was way in their future to come together.
Yeah.
So this was the early 90s when Hazelden owned Hanley. They built that with the Hanley family originally.
Okay.
Yes.
Tell us what you did for them.
So I really started out, I was going to the addictions counselor training, and I did my internship there. But while I was going through the schooling, I actually started out right at the bottom, a CD tech. I worked in the office. I transcribed all of the notes because we didn't have computers yet. Can you imagine that? So I'm listening to everything that all the counselors are dictating about all the patients.
They would record every session.
They would record, and I would sit in the office, and then I would type it all out, you know. And then it would be put in these paper charts, and we had locked drawers where we kept them. And so it was kind of this great thing. Like when you hear about CEOs of companies and they started out in the mailroom or something, it was like that. So that and then I kind of, started doing not like anything like group therapy, but kind of life skills groups and things like that as I went along. And then it was just a great period of time. So when I was hired there after I did my internship, it was like everything opened up. So I was able to get every level of care, every kind of experience you could have within inpatient and outpatient and halfway house and specialized treatment, like for older adults, finally landing on my very favorite part of all, and that was doing the family program. The family program was the best job of them all. Oh, well, I am the family, you know? So actually, I got in the field to work with the families. And I was told, well, you have to work with the alcoholics and addicts for 5 years before you get to work with the families. They let me do it after 4. But it was really smart of them because it's my belief, you don't really know this disease until you're in the trenches, inpatient treatment, carrying a caseload. That teaches you like nothing else about this disease, I believe.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So you found your passion in the family program. Was this like multifamily groups? Was this individual sessions? Tell us about that.
No, the Hazelden family program was really unique. Unfortunately, they're not doing it anymore. I think it was one of the great designs. And the way the family program worked is the families would come, but their loved ones, their beloved alcoholic, their beloved
Right.
addict in treatment did not attend the family program with them. Other people's family members in treatment came. And it was
Really?
absolutely magical because without all the emotional baggage, all the distorted emotions that come with loving somebody who has an addiction, none of that baggage was there. And so the bonding between these family members and other people's family members was incredible. And they could hear them and they could listen to them about the disease and their lived experience with it and their relationships with their family members and everything they'd been going through. And they could open up themselves, the patients, to these family members precisely because they were not their family members.
Right.
It was like it opened up the doors and windows and everything else where they could talk so freely. And it was magical because everybody walked away changed in an immense way. I mean, the disturbed emotions, all the negativity, it just melted away. The bonding was so strong. And of course, their beloved alcoholic and addict who's still on the units is a nervous wreck. You know, like what's going on
talking
over
about?
there? What
Yeah.
are they talking? But then they got that experience too with other family members. So it was one of the most beautiful experiences, you know, and we didn't do any therapy. It was just a very specific design. We did support group kinds of things, but not like individual therapy. And of course, their loved one wasn't there, so that wasn't happening. So it was a beautiful design, and it was extremely effective. And because of that, I started, and it had to close down during COVID, but we're going to open it back up in my hometown of Grosse Pointe, Michigan. A 12-step program that's both AA and Al-Anon. And that has had the same effect with wives whose husbands are in treatment. And they're like, that saved me because I'm listening to other alcoholics, other addicts who are in recovery. And
So an integrated group, like an open
group. Yeah.
Is it under the banner of a certain 12-step modality, or is it just
Yeah,
AA
it's
and Al-Anon?
absolutely 12-step, and it follows all of that, but it's bringing AA and Al-Anon together. And then a lot of the alcoholics and addicts that come who've been in long-term recovery, they've never heard the family talking
Right.
about what their experience is.
Right.
So I sort of mimicked the idea of that original Hazelden program, which, like I say, doesn't exist anymore.
That's really unique. So was there an existing Al-Anon and AA group that you were, so
No,
you
we
just started this meeting
it,
and it was like,
and
it's
then registered
open.
it with Al-Anon and registered separately with Al-Anon and AA.
Really?
Yeah. And amazing. And so we're going to start it up again. You know, it was an in-person meeting.
Sure.
And we're going to start it up again. And now people that started then, you know, their spouses have a few years of recovery, and they say, if it hadn't been for that, I'm talking about the families.
Sure.
Primarily the wives I'm talking about. Some husbands, I don't think we would have come back, our relationship would have come back as quickly. But in listening to those other alcoholics and addicts, I could have empathy.
Right. That's so interesting. It reminds me, you know, I'm in recovery. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you know that, but I am. And it reminds me of the work that hopefully along your journey you're asked to do.
Yeah.
Right. Whether that's about your family of origin or a trauma experience or these things we call relationships, which you end up writing on steps over and over about generally, and getting that kind of exposure to other groups and how they're affected is so unique. And I think in my experience, you're right. If you're not going to those sources to consume that information, you're not going to be taught those skills.
No.
Or you're not going to have that insight
Right.
about the other's perspective, which is super valuable. Like I've been to several Al-Anon meetings and they're so valuable.
They're so valuable.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'll be honest with you, there were some recovering alcoholics that freaked out about just some basic Al-Anon 101 things that people would be sharing. The Al-Anon people, that just, you know, I mean.
It was like groundbreaking for them.
It was groundbreaking. And, you know, I say there are a lot of people in AA or NA or other 12, addicted people that have lots, and their Al-Anon issues have never been met because the programs are not the same. I mean, it's the same 12 steps and much is the same, but the core is different.
Yeah, the atmosphere of recovery is unique generally, right? And so the topics and the flavor of focus tends to be traditional. And if you're not, you're right, Al-Anon is a totally different approach that's going to make you think about recovery is all about relationships, I think. And Al-Anon is going to present those relationships in a way that might otherwise be inaccessible. That is fast. I've never heard about that.
That's just fascinating. I mean, I remember my first Al-Anon meeting. I was blown away. I couldn't believe it. The topic was fear, and I was like, oh, that's what I feel all the time. Like a fish in water.
You still remember this meeting?
Oh, so crystal clear. And it just blew my mind. And the women there, I didn't know how you dressed for Al-Anon. This was the late 80s. I put a dress on, I put heels. And it's a basement, of a church at night.
Sure.
And they're already at this table, and they used to smoke then in meetings. This big blue billow. It's dark except for a light over them. Can you imagine this?
Right.
And I'm a little bit late, and it's clip, clop, clip, clop, clip, clop with my high heels across the linoleum.
Yeah.
And these women were so much older than me, but they had the hard knocks, they're missing teeth. To me, I'm like, oh my gosh, who are these people? I was like, but the lucky thing is I was still really concerned to please people. We like to please people in a healthy way, but I was in an unhealthy way. And I thought, I can't turn around. I'd hurt their feelings,
Right.
So thankfully I felt that way, because when I sat down there with these women, and I mean, in my mind, I'm like, oh my gosh. I mean, this sounds terrible to say, but this is the truth in my mind. It's like they're sea hags, like out of the books that you'd read.
Right.
And I was terrified. And then they started sharing. And I thought, it gets me emotional right now. I thought, I have never heard such wisdom in my life. And without knowing it, it was my first lesson in principles before personalities, and they blew me away. And that was it for me. Al-Anon was it ever after.
And you kept coming back, and you kept going to meetings.
And I ended up not going to that meeting.
Right.
But kept going to meetings. I found a fabulous home group, loved it. And I used to, because I was so blown away that other people were living in fear all the time. So I went to this meeting. It would be like a step and a topic. And I was always raising my hand. Let's talk about anger. Let's talk about anger. Because I couldn't imagine that everybody was living with that. It was such an eye-opener.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So you were not working in the field before this meeting?
No, I was in the arts field.
No kidding.
So this is a second career for me. And I so fell in love with the 12 steps. And then I finally decided I was going to get into this field. I had no idea how to do it.
How long a time was it before you made that decision between the first meeting and this is a calling?
Yeah, it was probably close to 3 years when I realized. I think I couldn't really put it together, but I thought, this is it. This is it. This is like the most amazing thing. I couldn't really put it together what I could do with it, but then I realized, people actually work in treatment centers, and they do this for a living, and you could go back to school and you could do that.
Right, and it's not a coincidence that you are a family member and that you were led to the family work at all.
At all,
right?
No,
yeah,
absolutely not.
And it's fascinating. I have actually not heard of that modality at Hanley, where you were introducing the patient to another family.
Yeah, and now remember, that was Hanley Hazelden. That was the Hazelden Center City treatment program.
Right.
I mean, family program.
Right.
That was transported to Hanley Hazelden, and it does not exist anymore anywhere.
That's fascinating.
Which breaks my heart, because I think it was so dynamic and wonderful.
I've heard so many stories of family members, whether they're parents, brothers, sisters, having so much positive benefit from being around addicts that aren't their loved ones.
Absolutely.
Just anecdotal. I'm kind of connecting that. That's interesting. Yeah. Because there is so much pressure. We have a family program that we've been doing since the 80s here at Cumberland Heights. And, it's multifamily groups, and you introduce the individual back with their families, and there can be a lot of stress about that in terms of expectations or conversations that party A and party B feel like they need to have, in a 90-minute group. So that's pretty fascinating. How has that, if any way, because how long were you working in that program?
So I was there for, it's been so long, I can't think. I think maybe a year and a half, because then Jeff and I moved to Washington, D.C., and he was working with the former Senator George McGovern, whose daughter died of alcoholism, and they started a family foundation. And I want to say something about this program, too. I want to backtrack because it's an important point. Is what it did was cool down the system, and it's key. You need to cool down the system because people's emotions are that they have at that time. Well, you know how it works. It closes up the thinking brain, right? You can't see well. But the other thing is that their emotions and what they're talking about is distorted. They're distorted emotions. They're distorted by the disease of addiction because everybody is a counterpart to the disease, right? Everybody's experiencing the disease. They're just experiencing it differently, right? And so we have to cool down the system. So that family program did that without our effort, is how it should be.
Right.
It was the people participating allowed each other to cool down.
Right. How long was it? Was it a one-day thing that families experienced, or was it a week?
3 days.
3 days.
3 days.
And do you remember, just pragmatically, what was the, psychoeducation, systems theory introduction, or was it all just open? Tell me about that.
No, we had definite educational pieces. We had, and we could talk a lot about education, and I'm here, of course, because I'm presenting tomorrow, because education doesn't really create lasting change. And
say more about that. That's interesting.
Yeah. So when we're going to kind of jump ahead here, I guess, but when I was writing the book, It Takes a Family, we had been doing structured family recovery, something called structured family recovery. And when I was getting ready to write the book, which was published by Hazelden, I learned a couple of things. One, that Stanford had a behavior design lab. And two, that the founder, B.J. Fogg, was doing a boot camp. And I thought, I have to get in that boot camp.
Right.
And they were taking 10 people, right? 10.
Right.
And you had to jump through hoops, and you had to do all sorts of things. And then the last thing they asked you is, what are you doing right now? Not something that's aspirational, but what are you doing right now that the information that you're going to get, that you will right now apply it to what you're doing? I thought, I've got this one for sure. And so I ended up going. Everybody was from big tech. I mean, Unisys sent their lead engineer from Tokyo. This was all big.
Interesting.
Microsoft, this was Facebook, this, everything. And the addiction girl, they all looked at me. I was the addiction girl. What really struck me is there was nobody from the helping professions there. And so we learned a lot, and I took a second one, more advanced. But you would be surprised at the things that people think will lead to lasting change that don't. One is education. And I'd like to say, we all like to have education. I love education.
Sure.
I'm all about education. But when we're talking about creating lasting change, that doesn't do it. And really, all you have to use is a little bit of critical thinking, because if that were true, we would all be at our healthiest. We are overeducated about health. We're overeducated about diet. We're overeducated about exercise, right? And all that education we get, as a country, we have a big problem. We have diabetes. We have all sorts of problems. So education may be wonderful, but there's a very specific way you have to use it, which came out of Rutgers University. And it's not education first.
It's interesting. It reminds me of my favorite thing about recovery, which I'm not a recovery expert or anything like that. I'm one example. But
you are.
Well, one of my favorite things is that recovery doesn't care what you think about it.
No, thank you.
Right?
Thank you.
Does not care what you think about it.
Does not care.
And meetings as an example, as one component of a recovery lifestyle, is a space where people can come and be as they are, right? And discuss and talk about things that are top of mind, perhaps, for them that day. And that's valuable so that we can connect and we can identify and we can make people feel welcome and all of that. But it's a reminder that as people who struggle with addiction, and families probably, we're so cerebral.
Oh,
right?
Sure. Absolutely.
And when I went back to school to become an MFT, which was totally by accident, I was so attracted to MFT systems theory because it also, too, doesn't care what you think about it. It's all about the system. It's all about manipulating the inputs and the outputs of somebody's life to drive change. And so there were these correlates between recovery and kind of educational psychology in a way and systems theory that were really congruent. And you're exactly right. Like, that's why it's so hard to start working out. Because in the beginning, it does not feel good. You're like, I would rather not, It's only until you get down along the path a little bit further that you start to experience those returns that are valuable. And it has nothing to do about what you think. No. Do I belong here?
Because the brain is lazy for a good reason. Because we know the brain's number one job is to keep us alive. And the brain doesn't know if we're going to have food tomorrow. Right? So anything hard, that's why learning calculus is really, 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 really feels really, really hard.
Right.
Going shopping seems really, really easy. So just like what you say, the brain is like, whoa, 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 this is going to take up way too much energy, and my job is to keep you alive. And so we don't, you're right. You have to get past that.
So when you're talking about the Hanley Hazelden program that you were part of, it makes sense that it wasn't just psychoeducation.
Right.
It was the practical experience of sitting in a group with a family member and identifying your core struggle as a husband, as a brother, as a sister, as a mom, as a son, whatever it is. And that maybe broke the seal for those families, as you talk about cooling down the system.
It cooled down the system. It happened so organically, and it's pleasurable. And the break time was almost the most beneficial.
Really?
Because when they just had free time, that's when they really created these relationships. They got to be really close. Really, really close, these families with, different patients. And so then they would bring that closeness into the next group, which would be that much better. But, when you talk about going, recovery, like you talk about going to, the early AAs, Bob and Bill, and the early AAs totally got it right. I'll say when my first boot camp, this fellow was with a Fortune 500 company. Halfway through, he came up to me and he whispered, "I'm a friend of Bill's," which of course we know means I'm an AA.
Right.
He said they could have saved 40 years of research just by going to AA. We laughed about it. But those guys got it right, and that's why AA works. That's why it works. And just what you said, you don't have to think, nobody's asking you to think. One of the things you hear in an AA meeting is, it isn't, if you want what we want, feel like we feel. It wasn't, if you want what we want, think how we think. It is, if you want what we want, do what we do. And that's key, because behavioral expectations are one of the things that actually create lasting change. I mean, AA is the perfect, petri dish to look at behavior design at its best.
Right. And it's absent of all the thought, right? Which is where all the black box of the mind, where your expectations and your hopes and all of that can really trip you up. And it's really, it sounds limiting. It sounds hard boned in some ways, right? Do before you think and all that kind of. But there's a lot of validity to that. So it's really
action
interesting.
Before motivation.
Right.
Motivation is also another thing that does not create lasting change. I mean,
that's right.
Does not.
Or everybody would be clean and sober.
Everybody would be clean and sober.
Right.
everybody would be at their goal weight. Everybody would be, you know what I mean? Like everything,
right.
Everyone's house would be spick and span.
Right.
It's just, we all live with that. We live that reality every day, but yet our brain tricks us, and we're told, this will motivate you.
Right.
Right.
It sort of reminds me of like that we're long familiar about the nature of our problems before we're willing to do anything about them.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
It's the same kind of component. I'm curious about your experiences in that program and the lessons you learned with your personal recovery and then professionally, and then kind of fast forwarding into structured family recovery.
Oh, yeah. Structured family recovery was like a slow rolling snowball, you know? And of course, my passion even getting in to this field was families, because I know I grew up 2.5 hours from Hazelden and we didn't even know it existed.
Really?
So my father was what they called a high functioning alcoholic, which is always outside of the home, not in the home, right? The functioning in the home, no.
Right.
And so my parents divorced, and it was kind of shattering for my brother and I. And I think, oh my gosh, if we'd known about Hazelden, if we had structured family, my dad would have been fabulous in AA. I mean, he would have loved AA. We didn't even know about AA. I mean, we didn't,
Wow.
So it really starts there, and the idea that, we talk about divorces as if it means nothing. That's not true. It's not true. And so all of that, but doing that Hazelden family program, that was key. That was key. I really couldn't articulate it in my head, but I felt what was going on at the time. And
Change.
the change and what happened, I didn't have the words cooling down the system, but I saw it over and over and over, and how that then radiated outward.
Which was different than you're experiencing working directly with the patient and calling the family.
Oh,
right.
absolutely.
Right.
I mean, very, very different, very different. And then, of course, my own Al-Anon meeting, that mattered too. But those weren't enough. I have to talk about this a little bit, because it's like over time, and this is where information and knowledge is really important, because it is important. It's just not going to create lasting change. But that driving, burning, slow burning passion, along with always being curious, always thinking creatively, always thinking about what works, and over time. And then the funniest thing happens, I think, when something's innovative, is it's not that you're sitting down, you've got papers and whiteboards and you're mapping it out.
Right.
But you're doing something like vacuuming, and the whole idea, it's like it's downloaded into your brain, because all of a sudden everything comes together and you go, I've got it. And that's just what happened. And people will say, well, how did you think of this? I can't tell you how I thought of it. It just arrived, but it didn't arrive out of nowhere. It arrived of, decades of work.
Right. Right.
And then it comes, and it came. I remember Prince said once that his songs came to him, the whole song at once.
Right.
It was like that.
Right.
The whole thing at once. And then it was a matter of implementing. And there was no book then. You know what I mean? Because the book has a whole year of structured family recovery meetings in it. It's written for families. Professionals use it, but it's not a training manual for professionals. And but yes, you're right. And I was just reading a study the other day, and it said innovative thinking. You've got critical thinking, going back to Socrates. You've got creative thinking. Plato talked about it. He thought it came from the gods, right? And then you've got innovative thinking, which is a different thing. And it was interesting, this study talked about the fact that, you can do a lot of things to become a critical thinker and a creative thinker. But innovative thinkers, they said, what we think now is that there are parts of the brain that typically aren't strongly connected to one another. And in people that innovate things, there is a much stronger connection. And so their brain is working differently. So I was reading that because it also makes me think, and there's another thing, I've had a few of these experiences, but this one, is because I thought, what happened? How did this come together like this?
All at once.
All at once. And so when I read that study, and I mean, it's not conclusive.
Sure.
You know what I mean? But it's something they think is happening. The neuroscientists is that with certain people, those regions of the brain are more closely connected and working together, which allows that to happen. I don't know. It's like a mystery.
Well, I think about your history and your experience too, right? Like, and identifying a problem.
Right.
Which at the time that you created this way of being or this modality or a presentation, whatever it might be, innovators solve for problems.
Right.
Or at least tackle them from a perspective that otherwise has been overlooked or minimized or not considered.
Right. And sometimes see problems that nobody else sees.
Right. Exactly.
Right from the beginning.
Exactly. And so much of your story, people talk about, like, not to be a little woo-woo today, but, people talk about fate or coincidence or serendipity, but you can kind of see from the outside. I met you for the first time today, but from the outside looking in, there was a reason that those connections happened, right? Certainly you had to do the footwork from a recovery perspective, but you did.
Right.
And that's a beautiful kind of recovery element that exists in your life and, like the tens of thousands of other friends that are outside of this room that we could speak to that, they were called, in some ways and were able to create something that drove change based on that passion, based on that pain.
Right.
Which I think is unique to our field.
Exactly. And the thing is, the door's open. If you've ever read Dale Carnegie, he talks, he spent his life studying very successful people. I mean, we're looking at, very successful people. And, but he said, when you start doing something and you're down the right path, that's when the doors open. I think anybody in recovery has experienced that, don't you think?
Yeah.
Really good recovery is that once you go down that path, then it's amazing. Doors that you never knew existed start opening.
Yeah, it reminds me of, one of those lines, from a specific piece of literature. Everything is subject to revision, especially what we know about the truth. Right. And our truth changes. And sometimes life just has a way of putting you in, at least to have the opportunity to open the door in front of those doors in a way that you just otherwise would not expect, right?
Absolutely.
I think oftentimes, even in this field, in behavioral health and addiction specific, at an addiction treatment center like this one that we're in today, a lot of people don't plan to show up here when they're 14. Professionally, right?
No.
It's quite fascinating that way.
I would say most people.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So if you were to describe to somebody who has never heard of structured family recovery before, give us an explanation of what it is, what you created, and what your work has been focused on over the past 20 years.
30
years. I shortchanged you.
Yeah, but I'd take 20 and I'll shave 10 years off.
No, 30 years. Yeah.
I'm talking age-wise.
Sure.
So you've asked a $64,000 question, just to like give that answer. I'll tell you a little story. So a friend of mine, his family owned a big business, family-owned business that brought in about $1 billion a year. Very successful.
Just a little business.
Okay. Yeah. So he ended up being the president. His dad stepped down. He ended up being the president. And then when he retired, he decided, he was a recovering person himself, decided to go back to school, get his master's degree, and start working a little bit in the field. So anyway, he got trained with SFR as an SFR counselor. And he said to me, I don't know, this is about a year later, and he said to me, Debra, I have spent the months trying to come up with the elevator speech for structured family recovery, and I can't come up with one. So I just say that to lay the groundwork. It's not an easy thing.
Got it.
Okay.
Big question.
So the thing about structured family recovery, this is the way I describe it. They're structured, right? Structured. It's very structured in a good way. It's not therapy. It's positive brain. It's all positive brain. There are weekly meetings. Every meeting is the same. I mean, the topics change, right? And it's paired
Sounds
with,
familiar.
yes, and it's paired with 12-step recovery. So let me say this first to explain. There are two things. There's one thing called virtue ethics, and there's another thing called role ethics, ROLE ethics, okay? Virtue ethics asks the question, who am I? Role ethics asks the question, who am I in relation to you? Okay? So structured family recovery answers role ethics. But the virtue ethics, that's the 12-step meeting. Who am I? That is where everybody goes and improves themselves, brings their improved self back to the family. And structured family recovery then answers the question, who am I in relation to you? Okay. We don't discuss either of those things, but that's what's happening. So the family team comes together, and it's one of those things where the sum of the whole are much less than what you end up with.
Right.
So like there's an opening statement. So it just says these are kind of the rules while we're together. Like we don't use you statements. We don't use I statements that are thinly veiled you statements, right?
Right.
We have red light, yellow light, green light. If somebody brings something up from outside of SFR, somebody just says, I think that's a red light issue. That's the end of it, right? So we start that every week round robin. Everyone reads the 7 expectations in the opening statement. Then there's a topic every week. So let's say the topic, week 38, is trustworthiness, okay? So the first thing we do is have a reading. It's going to be out of Courage to Change, the meditation book from Al-Anon,
Right.
or Daily Reflections from AA. But imagine this. This family member, let's say it's your dad, okay? Let's say you're the person who's newly in recovery or still in treatment. Sometimes people are still in treatment doing this. And it's your dad, and your dad selected the reading, right? Now, let me tell you, they will read every single reading in Courage to Change, for instance, on that topic before they select it.
Right.
Right? And then they read it, and you're listening, and your mom's there, and your sister, and maybe an aunt, maybe, some extended family members, and you're all listening to the reading, and then Dad shares why he selected that reading. Just think what happens to you, right? And then everybody else goes around, and they share their insights, round robin. Now, the SFR counselor is a small figure in all of this, so you don't. Everybody's assigned an order. It's a different order every week, and they're not introducing it, so they don't break that emotional thing that's happening. So just this first part, let me give you a story. So there's a woman, she's in treatment. It's a 90-day program, very well known. She joins, the first few meetings are just for the family, and there's reasons for that. She joins on the 4th week, and it is her dad that picked the reading. And then her dad shared about the reading. And then she broke down sobbing. You know what Oprah used to call the ugly crying.
Right.
She's heaving and sobbing. And this typically wouldn't happen, but the SFR counselor just had to stop things and said, what's wrong? And she said, I've never heard my father talk like that in my entire life.
Wow.
So right away,
Yep.
Then what happens is you have this report, discuss, plan. So I'm just explaining the mechanics of this, right?
Sure.
Report, discuss, plan. What went well in your recovery last week? This is all about the 12-step stuff. This is the virtue ethics going on, right? What went well in your recovery? What have you completed on your checklist? They're checklists. They create behavioral expectations. What could be improved? What are your goals for next week? And everyone reads the questions and answers it all the way around. Now, when I did that, I thought, I wonder how that's going to go over. That is their favorite part of the whole hour.
No kidding.
Report, discuss, plan. If they could, they would just talk about that the whole time.
Why? Why do you think that is?
I don't know.
Because I would have picked the other. I would have picked I want to hear
For sure.
what you're thinking about trustworthiness.
No, report, discuss, plan. Talking about. So now what is happening is they're talking about what they're achieving in their 12-step program. They're talking about what they've heard in their meeting or what they've heard from their sponsor, the wisdom. They're bringing it back into structured family recovery. And everyone is not only hearing what they're accomplishing, positive social norm, right? And what they're doing, behavioral expectations, but they're also getting the wisdom they're learning from their meeting, and they're bringing it in. They love it. And whenever anybody checks something off on their checklist, like I got a sponsor, right? We have a 3-second celebration. So there's just so much science. The brain just loves a celebration, right? Watch kids, watch dogs, watch somebody who just scored on a big, huge, like the Women's World Cup, watch that celebration. And they pick their own celebration. So we have international families. This is a French family, and their teenage daughter picked funky groovy, right? And everyone is like, funky groovy. Everybody together is celebrating you, and everyone loves it. And this particular family, now they go on vacation, road trips. They use funky groovy for everything, Man, this ice cream is so funky groovy. Their celebration is spreading through their life and through younger children and everything else. So this whole thing happens, and then we go into an area that's 3 paragraphs. They all work kind of in tandem with the 12 steps. So the first thing is learning something new. Same thing, round robin. One person reads it, everyone shares. The next thing is about whatever step. So we're on step 7 this month. And then there's something written, not 12-step related. They're getting that elsewhere.
Right.
But it's, and then finally working a program of recovery. And these aren't instructive, they're ideas and thoughts. And everybody shares. And it's just mind-blowing what comes out of these people's mouths. I mean, the spirituality that I remember one dad, he goes, I can't even believe these are the children I raised. I've never heard anything like this. Families will say it over and over and over. We've never talked like this. We've never, ever been this close. And then at the end, there's a little tiny assignment, and it's always sending them back out into the recovery community. So you're always going back out. You have to do your assignment with your sponsor in a meeting. And then when you come back next week, report, discuss, plan, you're going to talk about your assignment. So again, you're bringing that wisdom. But the thing is we want to say, your recovery isn't with the SFR counselor. Your recovery is out in this community. We're always sending you there. If you have a question, you have an issue, that's where you take it, right? And you can bring it back to us. So you're getting your answer. I learned that in treatment. I don't think when I did it, I was thinking about it, but because you've asked me these questions, I just realized, I worked as a counselor, and somebody would come in with a problem, I'd send them out to talk to a senior peer that was doing really well, and then come back to me by the end of the day and let me know about that conversation. Right. So I think there's another seed for you, Right. And then at the end, we round robin, do the promises from the big book. You can't believe that experience until you hear a family week in and week out, round robin, read the promises. And at the end, we think not, and they all say it in unison, Right. And it's so simple. I think, how did we never think of this? How?
It reminds me of your statement about the pioneers of 12-step recovery, right?
Oh,
Bill
yeah,
and Bob, they stumbled upon something sacred and unique and special and with so much value, and it's so simple. Of the tens of thousands of meetings that are going to happen today in this country, it's so simple.
So simple. Yeah.
And
wherever you are, what's going to happen when you walk in that meeting.
Right.
Right?
Right. Yeah, that reminds me, I've been to I've had the opportunity to go to meetings all over the world, and I've been to meetings where I couldn't understand the language, but I still was a part of the atmosphere of recovery. And generally, I understood that those meetings tended to be about relationships, just by way of the emotion that was being shared by the person. But a couple things that I want to say about this modality that you developed, because it matches perfectly with your experience. It's almost like there are so many seeds that I'm seeing that you're picking out from, whether that was working with the individuals or being a part of that family group or your own family's experience, that really nurtured your vision for how this could help families all across the world. So I just want to say that from the outside looking in, being introduced to that, it's fascinating to see how you kind of wrapped that up in a way that's probably super beneficial. And then the statement about the woman and her father, sort of like taking a moment to reflect on that, because there's so many, I've worked in private practice, I've worked in treatment as a clinician, I'm recovering now. But, there's so many times that I interact, and I'm not perfect at communication, as probably you are not either, right? But
no.
Especially with our own families. But people are thirsty, starving for connection. and the vehicle that you've created provides that.
Yeah, it does.
Have there been families not associated with addiction that have used this modality that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of, but that is such an insightful question. So when there have been times, quite a few times actually, when I've been speaking at conferences about this, and nurses or people who suffer from diabetes have come up to me and said, this has to be done for diabetics and their families. I think there's so many great ways that this could be used. And it's especially nice for diabetes, especially type 2.
Right.
Because you do have things like the gray sheeters. You've got 12-step, Overeaters Anonymous. You've got 12-step programs. The thing about it is, for some other things, it's figuring. The thing is, though, I'm going to back up and say, Al-Anon is so flexible. It's very well. I have to say, though, that it is used a lot with sex addiction. We get a lot of sex addiction families.
Why do you think that?
I know where that is because, Pine Grove has a freestanding sex addiction program called Gratitude.
Right.
They refer their families, and those families are all over it. And a lot of the family members go to Al-Anon, and Al-Anon's very inviting. They don't care. Very good for gambling. We don't get as much referral for that, but we have had that, and it's very good. And also for cultures, like we get families from France especially, and they don't really have recovery in France. Sometimes I think they catch on even faster because they don't have preconceived false ideas about it. One French family, the dad, very Catholic, very spiritual. He had a Jesuit who was his spiritual advisor, brilliant man. And he said, I don't know, I was working with that family. We were probably maybe 15 weeks in. He said, I always thought I was a spiritual person. And they were going to Al-Anon, expat meetings, American and Brits. And he said, I always thought I was a really deeply spiritual person, but this taught me I was not. He said, this has changed everything for me. Isn't
and
that
the core of that
interesting?
is recovery, right?
The core of that's recovery.
Yeah.
And the fact, so active in the Al-Anon program with his sponsor.
It just reminds me of the unique culture that recovery really creates all across the world, agnostic of culture, agnostic of religion or tradition or anything like that. People having the opportunity to discover a relationship with themselves, a relationship with higher power, and then other people is transformational. And the vehicle of 12-step meetings, is that it tends to be the classic or traditional delivery mechanism. I'm an adjunct professor on a graduate program, MFT and LPC programs here in Nashville, and one of the things I teach the addiction. I'm the addiction.
Oh, that's great.
Token.
That's great.
Professor. And these graduate programs get one class in addiction, which is fascinating in and of itself. But one of the things that we ask the students to do when they're there is to give up something for 28 days, which is all, we don't need to talk about that today, but it's fascinating. But another thing is to participate in the atmosphere of recovery. So go to meetings.
I love that.
Right.
That's fabulous.
And read the literature. And you're reminding me of, I had a student once, specifically I have them read the Narcotics Anonymous flat book, the Step Working Guide, which is robust. And if you're a family member and you want to check that out, you definitely should, because when you look at the questions there, it's a big lift, right? It's intense. It's not easy work. And I remember I assigned the reading for them to read the 4-step, which of course has another sort of recovery meaning. It's an infamous step, right? And they read all these questions and all these sections about selfishness and, a sexual inventory, but also the good. Remember, inventory is about the good and the bad.
Right.
And they came back to class, and, all of these professionals, they were about to graduate. There's master's level students and clinicians who have a myriad of experiences, and several of them, I've never done this work. It speaks to the families that you talked about.
Absolutely.
We've never had these conversations, right?
I think that's true of most people.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Or somebody sort of from a religious context saying, why haven't we, something's missing here. And that's not proclamation on anybody's practice or anything like that. But there is a depth to walking into a meeting and somebody having crack pipe burns on their lips and struggling that day to stop using. There's a transformational it gives me kind of goosebumps to think about that's happening everywhere all at once, if you will.
And the thing that's everything about it is such a paradox, really, because the old timer can say to that crack addict with the burned lips, "Thanks for saving my life today."
Right. And like we talked about, just in terms of the thinking that we tend to do, maybe not especially early on, because I think that in some ways it can be insidious and manifest at all different phases of life and recovery. But, that person in early recovery is, what are you talking about?
Right.
But that little tic-tac size piece of hope might be the thing that brings it back to the next meeting.
That's right.
Just a little bit more. So when I think about families that are participating in this program, that's what they're doing, is just this organic space to connect. And the beauty of it is the structure.
The structure is everything. So like I always say, it's like you take a little boat, you put it on a river, you put the people in, and the current of the river is structured family recovery. It's just going to take them. And it's just going to take them in that one direction. We never say to people anything about the structure. We don't educate people. We don't say,
Interesting.
Oh, it's the structure, and you're going to have this common language. There's no explanation like that. I mean, of course, there's a book to read, but
as professionals would associate with structure.
Right.
This is actually just structure in terms of a guide.
This is just the doing of it is structured, but we're not saying, it's structured, and you're going to have this common recovery language, and you're going to get this. None of that. But at the end, when people finish a year of meetings once a week for an hour, again and again and again, you hear the same thing. I loved the structure. I love that we share this language of recovery. Again and again, they know what it is. They know what's working. And then it's all positive brain, right? It's all positive brain.
Right. So do you see you mentioned family team when you first started talking about it, and I assume you chose that language specifically for a reason. So I would imagine that the family itself self-selects the participation?
They self-select.
Okay.
So the book talks about, looking beyond the nuclear family. That's a fairly new construct, right?
Right.
In the history of humankind. And that can make a big difference. But, sometimes there's not too many people. Maybe it's only two people. And the beloved alcoholic. Sometimes we have 7 or 8. It can vary so much from family to family. I usually say this is kind of the rule of thumb on selecting people. Whoever you'd feel comfortable eating breakfast in your pajamas with, that person would be right for your structured family recovery team. So it's not a casual friend, but it's your friend that's like family,
Right. The other thing is commitment.
Commitment. This is the thing. People, now, I don't want to be Pollyanna here. There's some people that fall away. Some people follow the disease. That happens.
Sure.
The book is also written for people to do it on their own in different ways. They can, sometimes people get started and they get going and then it's like the little bird flies away. We're big on that. You're doing good, you can go. Other people just don't ever go away. I mean, we have right now just a family that just celebrated 5 years. Every year the SFR counselors you guys can do it on your own. And they said, maybe year 6. They love their SFR counselor. They don't want to let go of her,
Sure.
Maybe year 6 we'll start doing it on our own. Somebody used to work with us. He has one SFR family left. He's doing something else. He goes, we're on week 199. I mean, how long do I have to do this with them? I go, well, you can only let them go from your side if you're really ill and you can't do it anymore, or you're retired. Otherwise, you cannot abandon your family.
Right.
And he's kind of wondering. So we get this. But the book is also written. There are people who do it totally on their own with the book. Sometimes we've had people call us and go, can we just work on the recovery plan with you? We're doing great. I know one family contacted me, and they're almost to year 7. They've been using the book by themselves. And it's made up of a father who's a physician, a mother who's a nurse, an uncle who's a psychiatrist, The beloved alcoholic is an attorney. And during this time, since they started, he met a woman in recovery and married her. And now they have twins. And they're almost to year 7 on structured family recovery. Every year they say, shall we end it now? And they all say, we're too afraid to lose what we have.
Wow.
So you see a whole family develop as they're doing this. But I always think of those twins. They're like 18 months now. Like how different their life will be.
Right.
You know?
Literally. How different their life would be.
Literally.
And it just, there's no doubt that a scaffolding like this or a structure like this would be beneficial for any family.
Any family.
Any family, even outside of addiction. That's the thing, right, that we're sort of beginning to dance around over and over again is finding ways to create intimacy, right? Finding ways to learn more about each other. Because homeostasis does take place in all family systems or all systems of any kind, right? Where it's normal to maybe dismiss with a minimum of concern or, you know, bad habits take root over a period of time that are pre-conscious processes that are really, once you set your temperature to 72, the old, you know, analogy of a thermostat, it's really hard to change your temperature, which is why treatment, the risk of treatment failure is so high for the individual without family intervention. You know, is that, you know, somebody leaves treatment and they have all these tools and they're part of a great program and they go back to the same 72. Well, they're probably out of luck because the other members of the system are going to push them back to that heated section.
That's right. Absolutely.
Or that common degree, which is really, really interesting. Have you...
Oh, and can I add one thing?
Please do.
I completely forgot about all this, to say this. I should have said it in the beginning.
Say it.
So structured family recovery happens via conference call.
That's what I was about to ask you.
Yeah.
So do people do telehealth, like kind of
and we do
Zoom?
We don't do
calls?
Zoom. You know why we don't do Zoom? Because it's so distracting. How I look, how you look. Somebody might be thinking, but I think they look bored, but they're actually really concentrating. We don't do Zoom. We do it on conference call. It's more intimate, the voices, just the voices. And this active listening, that's another thing family members go, I'm such an active listener now. So, and then you can do it anywhere. So I worked with a family once. There was somebody in London, Paris, a small town in Switzerland.
No kidding.
And one person that went to Costa Rica and another to Brazil. And all using conference call. So people can be anywhere.
That's so interesting.
And I'll tell you something. I'll tell you this. I was on one of our counselors with the pandemic. Just, you know, sometimes people just slide into another direction. Everyone was using Zoom. The family said, we want to use Zoom. So she said, okay, they did Zoom. They invited me in the last week. I mean, I kind of said, you know, we can't do this anymore for a reason. So I'm there and everybody's on Zoom and I'm looking at the beloved alcoholic. He's sitting outside and he's on a picnic table, sitting at a picnic table. And he's looking off. I'm like, what's up with him?
Right.
He's totally disconnected. He seems bored. They've done a whole year. What's going on?
Right. It's the last session. So
You think he'd really be engaged?
Right.
And I'm like, wow. And then it's his turn to talk. And he breaks down crying. Because at the end we say, talk to your team. Tell them what this has been like. He couldn't get the words out. He was so overwhelmed emotionally. And when he finally could talk, it was so beautiful. It was so powerful. And I realized this isn't why we do Zoom, because I misinterpreted completely what was going on with him.
Right.
So we don't want to, we're about listening to each other, not looking at each other in SFR.
That is an interesting discovery.
Yeah.
The active listening and not watching. Because I would have said, no way, need to be on Zoom. It's got to be that way but you know, it's just maybe a recipe for disconnection.
It is. And it works so well. Families know it too. And can I tell you one other story real quick? Because it's one of my favorites. So single mom, she's divorced, little girl. mom is a bad alcoholic. So the little girl has lived with alcoholism her whole life. She's now 5, and she's on the call. Mom's on the call with the SFR team, her family, right? And she had just gotten a sponsor. And so the little girl can hear all this. She's sitting next to mom because everybody's in their house. See, that's the other beauty of it. Nobody has to travel to an office. Nobody has to get childcare. Nobody.
I like where this is going.
Yeah. So you don't have
Just
to worry if you have makeup
coloring.
on.
Yep.
You can be in bed with a cold. You can be anywhere. You can be in the car at your kid's soccer practice.
Right.
But so the little 5-year-old girl is coloring right next to mom, who's on the call, and she hears everyone celebrating her mom, the 3-second celebration. The SFR counselor said she couldn't even speak because all of a sudden that little girl said, Mommy, good for you. That was great recovery.
Right.
And it blew the SFR's counselor's mind. She said, I couldn't talk because I was welling up in tears. I was ready to break down crying. She said, here this little girl has lived her whole life with addiction, and now she gets to sit and listen to recovery. Not just her mother, but her grandparents, her aunt, these close family members all participating together. And then she hears them celebrate, so she celebrates her mother. I mean,
Right.
just think this little 5-year-old, you know?
Which is different than therapy.
Yeah.
And also different than a parent carrying their child to a 12-step meeting, which can
Exactly.
both be valuable.
Right.
Right. But
Right.
this family recovery element that otherwise might not exist. I mean, it really is a good vehicle to create change. So talk to me about, I have a couple more questions.
Sure.
Or a couple more potential things to discover with you. Talk to me about how, in your experience, you see the differences between a traditional family program and a treatment setting and structured family recovery, and perhaps how these organizations choose to use structured family recovery.
You know, it's interesting that you should ask that question because I just did a graduate thesis on, family programs are actually called multi-family group programs.
Yeah, I alluded to it earlier.
Yeah. So there's not a lot of research when we're looking in the addiction field on that. You can go into the VA for like traumatic brain injury or post-traumatic stress disorder, things like that. So I've done a lot of thinking about this, but my short answer is, first of all, family programs they vary in a lot of ways. So there's not, we're using one word for a lot of different things. But let's say just the best of the best family program, okay? I would say I think it's valuable. I think it's a great first step, the best of the best. But it's a little bit like going to a great motivational speaker. And you're just like, wow, there's some residual value, don't get me wrong.
Sure.
But after a couple weeks, a lot of that just goes away. A lot of it's forgotten. If people just understand, that's why I think the Hazelden thing was so brilliant, because that was different. That was emotional connection, and that sticks with you, right? And it depends what you're doing. And some family programs heat up the family, And there was a study, and I'm sorry I can't tell you who did the study off the top of my head, but they looked at this. They looked at this family program. They went through several months. I forget how many, maybe 9 months of family programs and all the participants. They had kind of a nice sample, and it was so apparent to me when I was reading it. These researchers don't understand addiction. Not really. Not deep down, because all these. What they were looking for is readiness. Readiness is another word for motivation, so we get tricked by that word because it's not really important, as it turns out. But and they were so ready to do these things, right? And they had a follow-up that was going to happen like 55 days later or something. And 75% of the participants did not respond. And they're like, well, really, they didn't know why that happened. Well, I know why that happened, because they were back in crisis, and they're not responding to this study, because what they thought is that what happened over 3 days was going to carry people into their future.
Right.
And it isn't. And that's where structured family recovery carries people into their future. Family programs are great. to go to, most of them. And I also say to people, if you're ever in a family program and they're asking you to do something you don't feel is right, you don't have to do it.
That's exactly right.
You don't have to do it. You can say, no, I'm not comfortable with this, but you have to have something that carries you into the future. And we have families that will never miss a week. They'll do a whole year without ever missing a week. We had one guy, he worked internationally a lot, and he accidentally booked a international flight, departing on the night of their SFR meeting, and he changed it. And, departing flights aren't easy to change, right?
Sure.
He changed it. He said, oh, no, I won't miss this.
Sure.
So it tells you, I'm speaking more about the fact that this is a vehicle that allows families to belong to each other again,
Right.
That they can belong. They love belonging to each other.
Versus an introduction into what addiction is, or roles, or hierarchy and power, followed by, which is valuable, right?
It's very valuable. Very valuable.
Nick and Debra are not minimizing the value of that kind of
all.
family
I ended
work.
up going to a family program for a friend who was in treatment, and they did the whole, the whole family. Why am I not thinking the word? The whole family model. The
Genogram?
no, like the Sharon Wegscheider cruise where they acted out. You've got the
A sculpt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was like a really important thing for me.
Sure.
It was incredibly important. All of a sudden, I remember thinking, have they seen my family? Have they been inside my home,
But there's a difference in sort of like an intervention and...
That's it.
I hesitate to say lifestyle, but way of being.
A way of being is a really good way to put it, actually. A way of being. It's a different way of being, and no one's teaching it to you. You're doing it right from the beginning, which is actually the way to do it.
Can create lasting change.
It creates
potentially.
lasting change.
Yeah. For those that are plugged into it and are participating.
And stick with it.
Yeah.
So
how do you see programs implementing SFR today?
You ask such good questions. I just want you to know. So this is a big issue because treatment programs are designed in a certain way for a certain job that they do. They try to do some other things, and some do it well, some extra little things. They might have transitional housing, really good IOP, some really valuable things. But
For the addict.
For the addict, exactly. Thank you. So the thing about it is, and this is something that weighs on me because I know how well structured family recovery works for people, is that it doesn't fit well with treatment centers, actually. So this is kind of a tease because I'm not talking about it yet. So then something else, that's really weighed on me. I'm like, how do we get this to families? How do we get this to families? There's a family that did this, and they worked with somebody I trained, and they're wealthy, and they're in their home state. They're looking at putting in all the drug courts. They're trying to get it to other families. Even families are trying to get it to them. But so I'm working on something now that someday we'll do this again called Family Recovery Lab, which I think is going to be the vehicle, and it's something that treatment centers can use, and they don't have to integrate it.
So is it that, because you mentioned the fact that there are SFR counselors who I assume have been through a training program with you or your institute.
They go through a training, which is really important because when you read the book, which is written for families, professionals think, well, this is easy. No, it isn't easy. It's really not easy because it's so counterintuitive and so different than everything counselors have been trained to do. So I actually got a registered trademark for structured family recovery with the U.S. government to protect the work, which is ethical because when I protect the work, I protect families and I protect those people that invested in getting trained.
Right.
So nobody can read this book and be an SFR counselor because they think they are. And it's important for me to say that because that happens a lot and families get tricked and then people do it wrong and then it won't work for families.
And so most folks can probably find those who are identifying or credentialed appropriately through your website.
They can find, our website, which is lovefirst.net, if they call, we can put them in touch with somebody who has been trained. And we do, with our trainings, we include case supervision so that they actually do it. People that follow through with case supervision then are what we call certified. You have people who are trained in it, And then we have people who are certified. The certified people actually have like a gold seal they can put on their website because they have completed certification. That's key. We do really sophisticated simulations. So it's really hard. People fall on their face, which is, you learn by making mistakes.
100%.
All the way. I never forget anything when I've made a mistake. I learn it that way. It's indelible.
Mistakes are much more valuable than victory.
Exactly.
100%.
Absolutely.
Yep.
It's so nice that you know that.
Yeah.
Really, not a lot of people do. Mistakes are valuable.
Yep.
And then when you're out in the field doing it, you need case supervision.
100%. And you got to have that feedback, and that's one of the unique things about some training programs, like whether it's a two-way mirror.
Right.
If you're a student looking for a graduate program, make sure they have the live supervision because it's just different.
Absolutely.
You get a different level of preparedness.
Yeah, and that's why we include it with the training. It's not an extra cost, to make it really simple for people. They don't have to struggle with, do I want to pay for this or not?
So how long have you been certifying these folks, and how many are in this country?
Now, I cannot answer that question because I've not added them up. I've been doing this. The book came out, this is the second edition now. And if people get this book or listening to this, they should be getting the second edition. Hazelden Publishing, it's the second edition because it has the red heart on the cover. The first edition came out in 2014. I learned things since then, so we did a new edition.
Sure.
So 2014, the book came out. 2015 was the first SFR training, which we did live. And now, because of the pandemic, we do it virtually on Zoom, and it's fabulous. I'll never go back. And then all the simulations are done on conference call because I can keep people much longer that way. It costs them less money to do it. And it's a better training all the way around. So that's how we do it. So people don't, and I set it up where it's like evenings and weekends, except for one Monday. So most people don't have to take time off work or have problems, and they can do it from home or their office or whatever.
So this is really the beginning of y'all's journey with Love First and Structured Family Recovery.
Yeah, so the book's now Love First, third edition. Structure, It Takes a Family, second edition, are written as companion books. So Love First is intervention, but it also talks about structured family recovery and moves them right into it. So we really do have a continuum going on, and it's before, during, and after treatment.
Right.
And when we do interventions, we have them get both books because, you're never going to get a higher motivation wave than at the time of intervention and right before you get somebody into treatment. So we want them to make a commitment then, which they do. Most people, not everybody, you never get 100% of anything. They make that commitment. We start the family first because by the time their beloved alcoholic joins, they need to be comfortable with the process. They need to have gone to at least one Al-Anon meeting, be able to share positive experiences with Al-Anon, and only then can we then bring them in. If they're still in treatment, also the clinical team would be involved, knowing that, we want to invite them in and arranging for a time that they could actually do that.
Yeah, and for those that don't know, Debra's husband, Jeff, which is sort of we haven't touched on that. We're gonna do that again, which is the intervention side of your lives.
That's right.
And,
exactly.
And that you guys have been doing for a long, long time.
Long
So it really does fit together in y'all's partnership and professional kind of trajectory. So if we're an organization, like Cumberland Heights as an example, so how can an organization sort of support structured family recovery? Like, how do we implement it? I'm sure there'd be professionals interested in that.
So there are a couple of ways couple of things that you can do. I can give you an example of another treatment center, what they did.
Please.
If it's all right. Can I say their name? That's all right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
yeah.
Pine Grove, which has been around for a long time.
Sure.
They're in Mississippi. And they brought me in, I think 3 different times to do trainings with all their different departments. They, we design our own websites
All
and everything.
different departments.
All different departments, admissions, everybody. So I did like in services, but then broke it down and talking about people, what's their job, what can you do in admissions, et cetera, et cetera.
Good for Pine Grove because it's really a cultural investment.
It is.
And everybody knowing and being familiar with structure.
Exactly.
Does that make sense? To best support individuals.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
And so then they built a whole page on their website. We gave them some of the things that they could put on there.
Right.
And then every family gets a letter, and in that letter, they're told to get a copy of It Takes a Family. And the one thing that I think the people that were there then that did the family program are gone now, so that family program piece, I don't think that they know what to do with it.
I see.
So there's a little hole there, and that's what happens, when people leave. But what we do is we get a lot of referrals from them. And I think the two departments that send us the most referrals are Gratitude, which is the Sex Addiction Treatment Center, and PEP, which is their professionals program. So you have executives, docs, lawyers, things like that. But every family gets a letter. So the family that I talked about that had the psychiatrist uncle and everything, and they're
high achievers.
High achievers are getting on to year 7. That's where they found out about the book. And they said, we were just looking for a light in the darkness. And the husband, who is a physician, is on, different boards that reviewed programs and things like that. He said, as we were reading it, this was the only book that had a program, and it made sense to us. So it's because their son went to PEP that they found out about the book. Now, the other thing is that treatment centers can do is bring in somebody who's trained in SFR to talk about it, which they should call me. I could probably do a good job talking about it, but I know somebody else that was trained by us, I think, can do a good job talking about it. And, people don't have to be there in person anymore. You can even have a family program. They're there on Zoom. And you can bring somebody in that, and they should get a hold of me, because it's not just anybody that's going to be able to talk well about it. Do you know what I mean? That's a good speaker. But let people know, because the families, I've been places where I've talked at family programs where the families start crying, because it's like they haven't had anything that made sense, that gave them so much hope. They're looking for that. They really are looking for that. And they're in family programs, and they're they want to behave really well in family programs. They do.
Yeah, they're showing up. There's professionals here.
Yeah. They're
similar
looking
to your
at
experience.
me. They're
I'm going to put my dress
evaluating me.
on.
Yeah, right.
100%.
100%. But the thing is, they're looking for hope.
Yeah.
But it has to be meaningful.
Yep. And those the multifamily groups, which is sort of what we talk about through a family program lens, where there's a combination of psychotherapy, maybe psychodramas, which is a bit more experiential, and written homework where they're coming back each day. You're right. It's pretty intense, and it can be not to eliminate, because I think there's, like you said, there's great family programs that are doing great work, but it's compact and robust, and can be a spark, and the systems approach would suggest that you need that continued support and structure, no pun intended, right?
Right.
But you really do.
You do.
You really need that structure.
And you have to remember, when families come to the family program, their prefrontal cortex isn't, they're not really relaxed. Their
100%.
prefrontal cortex is really restricted. They have a lot of tunnel vision, a lot of what you tell them, a lot of what they go through. They're not really picking up, because they're
still in crisis.
They're still in crisis.
Yep.
And now they're really nervous, because they're also with professionals, and the professionals are watching them, they feel.
Right.
Which they are, and their loved ones there. And there's a lot. There's a lot that goes on.
Right. It sort of reminds me, I had some colleagues when I was in graduate school at Texas Tech that did neuroimaging research on family members.
Oh, interesting.
Of those who experienced addiction. And what they found which was congruent with terminal illness literature, just in terms of you're affected when your loved one gets sick. Why would we not transplant that to addiction? But
right.
Instead of classic neuroimaging studies, usually a task-oriented imaging process, or picture, image-oriented, where showing you cues associated with negative, positive, or appetitive imagery. And the appetitive imagery or the experimental design of the study was inserting pictures of that family member's loved one.
Interesting.
And taking pictures of the brain,
Wow,
specifically the
that's
prefrontal cortex.
fascinating.
And what they found was the same areas, doesn't really matter where it was, right? But the same areas of the prefrontal cortex was lighting up, as does the individual in recovery. And so, in fact, I was on the first paper I've never gotten a worse review for a peer-reviewed study. And it was clear that one of the reviewers was having sort of a reaction to our suggestion that, these individuals were addicted. But that's not what we were suggesting. It's just, hey, there's a common effect, right? So we were calling it co-addiction. We had to change that because the reviewers were not happy with that.
They didn't like that. But that is fascinating.
One of the things I want to sort of just conclude with that I think is just a beautiful part of your experience that has informed structured family recovery is the group, and I hope it comes back to Grosse Pointe.
Yes, we are. I'm already
AA
talking to people
meeting.
that we're bringing it back now that things have really settled down a little bit with COVID.
I'm feeling inspired here in our community, to create those spaces, because I think that there are those, my partner's in Al-Anon, and so she has a wealth of experience, right, attending those groups, and the process of discovery with our partners, with our family members, it is so distinct. Mm-hmm. It's so separated, almost like a church denomination.
Yes.
You're like, oh yeah, we're talking about the same things, But hey, when you're looking at some of that literature and the step work, it's different.
It is,
and it's asking and challenging of your recovery in different ways. And so, if there's anybody that's interested, and we happen to be in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, we should probably attend that group to check it out. But otherwise, I think communities should be building in that direction.
You are more than welcome. I mean, we're going to get it up and running, and yeah, absolutely. And one person from that group happens to be my sponsee. When she joined that group, her husband was in treatment, I think his second treatment, and they had 4 little kids. And she said, that's saved my life. A regular Al-Anon meeting, she said, would have been great, but because I could listen to these recovering addicts talk, she goes, that's what I realized that, and her husband has phenomenal recovery today, phenomenal. But she said, that's what I could hang on to, I could understand it. And I think that's really important.
I think you're right. Well, we're glad you're here.
I am so glad to be here, and I'm so glad we did this together. I've had a great time with you. This has been a great conversation.
I really enjoyed it, and you're the first podcast that we've done. Well, we're resuscitating, if you will, an older podcast, but this is first in our River Road studio, and so we're excited that you agreed to be a part of that. And I'll just say, Jeff is going to come. Right? We're going to hold him to that.
Absolutely.
He'll listen to this, maybe not. It's fine. But we want him to come. We want him to talk about sort of his own experiences and be a part of that. And maybe we can do a collaborative connection with y'all in the next few years, which would be a lot of fun.
That would be a lot of fun. That'd be great. Jeff's coming, for sure. He's coming. Yeah. And just everybody who's listening cannot see your studio, but it is so beautiful. I walked in. It took my breath away. You guys have done a great job here at Cumberland. You'll get a lot of beautiful, fantastic, amazing work out of this studio.
Yeah, thank you. It's
just a wonderful space, and you ask really good questions.
Well, thanks. Thank you. I'll try to take that compliment as best I can, but that's why we wanted this to be conversational, right? Instead of like a traditional interview. And really, it's shout out to Ryan and Starla who are here in the studio. They're the ones that put it all together to make sure that we had it. And Stacy Bridges, making sure that we were where we needed to be, and Steve Lee. Those are the ones.
Stacy is fabulous.
She's
great. Does a great job. Yeah.
She's great.
No, this was great. I was I'll admit, I was a little bit like, oh, we're having a conversation. I'm like, what is that going to be like? You know what I mean?
Right.
And it's been an absolute pleasure. I've had so much fun. I hate to end it.
Thank you. Thanks, Debra.